and was what? To look whether it is associated with a given disease. So because of that multiple causality, then we need to have what? That comparison group.
Yeah, this expected level for another group, what this means actually?
Expected level means in the absence of risk factor, what do you have? In the absence, that is expected level. The other is what? Due to exposure.
Observed group is already exposed, right? And
Observed
the second
group, this one just take it, your group of interest. Group of interest. The other group is what?
Expected.
And yeah, with expected level. Group of interest, when I say group of interest, it's the one that you assume is exposed or the ones with disease. So that is your group of interest. Then the other part is what? The one with that expected level. So when we say exposure, again, we really don't talk about a single item. It can be food, exposure to vectors, or sexual partner, age, marital status, socioeconomic status, access to medical care. So exposure can be really several conditions. And then always group of your primary interest is exposed. It's always good if you really keep this in mind. So if you say people who don't have access to medical care, then that is your group of interest. If people with low socioeconomic status are your group of interest. So that is what we call exposed. Then the other group, if the people with access to medical care are what? They're just comparison group. So what you are trying to ascertain is what? Lack of access to medical care compared to those with access to medical care. So the other is comparison group or unexposed. So exposure is really a very loose term. So you really have to understand that. Now, what we calculate in cross-sectional study, as I said, cross-sectional studies measure prevalence. So what we calculate here is prevalence ratio. Prevalence ratio. That means we have what? We have two prevalences now. Prevalence in our group of interest, which is exposed, and prevalence in the other group, which is not exposed. So the prevalence of the two is what we call prevalence ratio. The prevalence of the two prevalence, the ratio of the two prevalence is what we call prevalence ratio. So you divide proportion in group 1, which is your group of interest, by the proportion in group 2, which is the other group or comparison group. So again, that group of interest or exposure is what? It's a very loose term. It can be just demographics or sometimes even what you eat. So if you think salad is the cause of a given condition, then you have both those who eat salad are what? Exposed, and the other group are not exposed. So you really have to look at that one in a very loose way. So once the way to analyze is again is simple. We come down to our 2x2 table. We have a disease, non-disease, and then we have what? Factor present and absent, and that is what we just look at the joint distribution. So in cell A, you have what? Disease is present with factor. In cell C, disease is present without factor. Because of what? Because of multifactorial nature. But if the disease and factor are related, we assume that the disease is what? More frequent here. That's what we are trying to ascertain. But still, because of that multifactorial nature, even those who are not exposed may still get the disease. So prevalence ratio is what? Our group of interest is those that are exposed. That means probability of disease given exposure divided by probability of disease given no exposure. So disease and exposure divided by disease, but no exposure. So again, when we expand this one, disease given exposure means what? Disease and factor divided by what? Probability of factor or exposure. This one. I think you know this one from our 2x2 table when we talk about sensitive specificity. Disease positive given factor positive means disease positive and factor positive divided by factor positive. So this is your numerator. Your denominator will be what? Disease positive and factor negative divided by what? Factor negative. So disease positive, factor positive is this, then factor positive is this. So it's what? A over A plus B. This is factor positive, disease positive, factor positive. This one is factor positive. This one is disease positive and factor negative, and this is factor negative. So A over A plus B and C over C, C plus D. So this is what? The prevalence of exposed group, and this is the prevalence of non-exposed group.
Is this
So
also called a risk ratio?
risk ratio, no. The formula looks the same,
Yeah.
but mind you, here we are talking about what? Prevalence. When we are talking about risk, we are talking about incidence.
So why the formula is same if it's a prevalence and risk ratio is don't?
It is what you are measuring. What you are measuring here is what? Prevalence. Okay? The other one you are measuring incidence. So although you use the same formula, they conceptually or technically they are really different. Yeah, because of what you are measuring. So now, again, we are talking about two values, numerator and denominator. If the value is 1, that means numerator and denominator are what? The same. So that means there is no association between what? Between disease and exposure. If it is greater than 1, means numerator is bigger than denominator. Numerator is about exposure. So exposure might be a risk factor. If PR is less than 1, the numerator is bigger than the numerator, that means exposure must be what? A preventive factor. So the rest, what you see down there are what? Common adjectives that are used to interpret the magnitude of association. The key is that 1 PR or prevalence ratio equals 1 means no association. Greater than 1 means exposure must be a risk factor, because that means numerator or factor is what? Disease is high in the exposed group compared to non-exposed group. In the last one, PR less than 1, that means denominator is greater than numerator. So exposure comes a preventive or sparing factor. So that's what you see, for example, if you are assessing vaccination. Vaccination always, if you consider vaccinated group as exposed, then always it leads to prevention of disease. So in that case, the denominator will be bigger or greater than the numerator.
Dr. Bogali, the 1.1 minus 1.3 weak, you're talking about numerator or you're talking about the association? What is it, 1.1 minus 1.3?
It does read that. It's equal to 1, or from 1.1 to 1.3, from 1.4 to 1.6.
2 is not minus, okay.
No, it's not minus 2, yes, it's 2.
Did you say the denominator is the exposure and the numerator is the risk?
Disease.
The numerator is the diseased. Okay.
So this is one example. The following data is from a survey of anemia in women. The researcher wants to know whether literacy is related to anemia. So they grouped women into 2, based on what? Based on literacy rate. So you have illiterate people, women, and literate women, and then there's certain anemia in the 2 groups. So all you have to do is that you fill out these cells if you want. You don't need for the analysis, but you can do that. Then this one is 200. Here you have 250. So prevalence ratio, as I said, is what is, if you want the formula, is A over A plus C. plus C. This is prevalent
C.
in the exposed, which is in the illiterate group.
C is
And then
C over C plus D.
then you divide this one by
C over C plus D.
C divided by so A over A plus B is 50 divided by 100. And then the other one is 50 divided by 250. So this is 0.5 divided by, I think it's 1 over 5 is 0.2, which is equal to 2.5. So this is your prevalence ratio in this case. So if we are doing formal analysis, we always start by giving overall prevalence, but in this case I just went to comparative analysis. So the first one is, again, A over A plus B is in exposed group, because if they are literate, it's awareness, so they can read about, any condition, so they are in better condition. Literate people, illiteracy means if they cannot read, then they really don't have any know-how about the condition. So that is what the study is all about. And so based on this, we have what? We have a prevalence ratio of 2.5.
How can you interpret again 2.5?
That's my question. Can you try? Can somebody try for me? Yeah, interpretation is really a key. And again, when you interpret it, you can just say
It is ratio of illiterate over illiterate.
You can just say this one. It's the exposure must be a risk factor. But you
So
can
it's
say
moderate.
literacy must be a risk factor, but always is good if you use the number that you have, because that is really important. As you see here, that means something. The number means something. So it's always useful to use the number, to quote the number.
So do we say moderate?
No, I'm just saying to use the number. Use the number in
Wait.
interpreting, yes.
So we don't interpret the numbers based on their magnitude of association? Like, wouldn't it be between 1.8 to 3, which would be moderate?
You can say that, but what I'm saying is try to use the number, because that range is so wide. It obscures.
2.5 prevalence of anemic women due to illiteracy. Risk ratio. Also prevalence ratio. That's due to illiteracy.
Yes, it is, but how do you put it in plain English, in plain English? That means don't complicate it so that anybody can understand. Anybody who can try? You are comparing it to two groups, isn't it? Illiterate and illiterate people. your numerator is what? Your numerator is illiterate, and your value is 2.5.
Literate, yes.
2.5. So it's just using that one. So you can say, in simple terms, anemia is 2.5 times higher in illiterate woman compared to literate woman. So you can just put it that way simply. 2.5 times higher in illiterate woman compared to literate woman. So always when you are doing the analysis, even if it's not indicated, especially in the assignment, please interpret your result. I know some of you are already trying to do that, but I want everybody to do that. So, this is, I think, the simplest of all. You have one example here. This one, I put it in multiple choice because that is how we have it in exams. Do this one in that way, but always please try to do the analysis. First do the analysis, and then this is the format that will be happening in the exam. So that's why I put this one. But this is another one. This one you have to show me all the steps here. So drawing the table, putting the values as well, and then doing the analysis. Any question?
What are they doing?
Thursday.
No, it's too much. Next week.
What happened?
Next week, Thursday?
Next week's Tuesday will be fine.
Next week, Thursday?
It's closed?
Next week Thursday? Next week Thursday.
What about Tuesday?
Yeah, that works. But you said Thursday.
You did say Thursday.
It's too much studies.
Okay, then next Tuesday. Okay.
Thursday?
Thursday.
Do you mean Thursday?
Thursday.
I tried.
Let me
So I don't have to.
introduce you to the cohort study. This cohort, the word actually came from cohort. It means a company of soldiers. That means the same type of soldiers. In old Roman army, it's a band of 300 to 600 soldiers. But the key here, when we're talking about cohort studies, is group similar in some trait. Group, if we talk about one cohort, we mean that group that they are similar in some trait, and so they move forward as a unit or as a group. So now, based on that original word, term, now, cohort studies refers to a group of individuals that share, cohort refers to a group of individuals that share what we call a common characteristic. So you can have birth cohort, for example, born in the same period, inception cohort, individuals assembled based on some factor, for example, where they live or work. So we're going to talk about whatever cohort you have, birth cohort, inception cohort, exposure cohort. So that means what? Groups similar in some trait. As I said, exposure cohort, individual assembled as a group based on some exposure. So we have several kind of these groups. For example, asbestos exposure in shipyard. Now, when we expand that one into cohort study, it means the observation of cohort over time to measure health-related events or outcome. Now we have cohort, group similar in some trait. Cohort study means observing that cohort over time for any health outcome or to measure health outcome. So what cohort studies normally do is what? Healthy subjects are defined according to their exposure status. So you first ascertain what? You first ascertain exposure in healthy individual. Healthy subjects, according to their exposure status, and they're followed over time. They are followed over time to determine the incidence of symptoms, disease, or death. So the first thing that you do in cohort studies is what? You have two groups. One group is what? With exposure, and the other groups without exposure. And then you follow these groups over time. That time depends on what you are looking at. So you follow them over time to ascertain the outcome. So usually you have what? Two groups. When you say cohort, usually you have two groups, exposed and unexposed group. Again, when you say exposed and unexposed, again, exposure is what? It's still a very loose term. It can be anything. So you have two types of cohort studies based on the timing. In all the cases in cohort studies, we have what? We start from exposure and then go to outcome. But based on the timing of cohort studies, we have two types of what? Cohort studies. The first one is prospective cohort. Prospective cohort means you group your participant or study a population based on what? Based on current exposure status, exposed and unexposed. And then you follow them in time whether the disease develops or not develops. So that means what? Because you are ascertaining that you are following exposed and unexposed group in real time, that means when the study started, outcome have not yet developed. So the investigator has to what? Has to wait for the outcome. So that's what makes it prospective. Because by the time the study started, the outcome have not yet developed, and the investigator must what? Must wait in real time for the outcome.